It's a singular honor and privilege for the Center for Policy Research to welcome Professor Stephen Kotkin and Professor Pratap Mehta for a conversation on the future of Russia and the world order. My name is Rahul Verma, and I work at the Center for Policy Research. And I'm deeply sort of like honored to introduce both Professor Kotkin and Professor Mehta, two of the finest minds of our time, especially on global thought and global politics. Professor Kotkin is one of the world's foremost historian and authority on Russian history. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and Freeman Spogli Institute for the International Studies at Stanford University. Professor Kotkin also happens to be a graduate of University of Berkeley, California, Berkeley, my own alma mater. So thank you, sir, for being here. He's Professor Emeritus of History and International Affairs at Princeton University, where he taught over more than 3 decades. And in these 3 decades, he has helped us understand authoritarian systems and how authoritarian countries try to negotiate their place in the world order. He's best known for his two-volume biography, which is already out on Stalin, and the third volume is on making. And so I would request for those who haven't got a chance to look at these volumes, please do look at them. Thank you, Professor Kotkin, for being here. Professor Pratap Mehta, he's former President and Chief Executive of Center for Policy Research. Professor Mehta has taught at many places, including Harvard, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Ashoka University, where he was also the Vice Chancellor of the university. And Professor Mehta writes almost on weekly basis for the Indian Express, and we have all learned from his writing. So thank you so much, Pratap, for coming here, and Professor Kotkin and Professor Mehta will be in conversation after Professor Kotkin's lecture. And I think like for an institute which continues to face great challenges, it's like, having these two people have a conversation, and what a way to sort of like mark the end of year 2024. But let me invite first our current President and Chief Executive, Srinivas, who also happens to be the Ministry of Jal Shakti Chair. And so he makes rivers and waves with his research. So I'll invite first Srinivas to make a welcome remark, and then get Professor Kotkin to speak for 35 to 40 minutes, and then both of them can have comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul, and a very good evening to all of you. Professor Kotkin, Professor Pratap Mehta, and friends, on behalf of Center for Policy Research and also India International Center, it is my privilege to welcome you for this talk today on the future of Russia and the world order by Professor Kotkin. December is a very busy month, particularly in Delhi. And I know for sure there are two talks exactly at the same time, one on China and another on Sri Lanka, within 2 kilometers radius. Having, not so contemporary Russia, I guess, if I may say that, to get you all in this room, I think it's a credit for the distinguished speakers that we have today. We are truly honored to host this talk, and I'd like to thank Professor Kotkin for agreeing to give this talk today, and also Pratap to having agreed to chair this talk. At CPR, Rahul was mentioning about it. We have just completed 50 years, and we have just begun our next 50 years. Many of you understand what I mean by that. CPR carries out research on many areas, but if you look at our reputation and its own reputation, or if you want to call it notoriety, that is primarily because of the most visible work that we do on foreign policy and security studies. So it's quite natural for us to feel very excited about having Professor Kotkin talk about Russia and its politics today. And many of us, I don't have to tell you, many of us have known Professor Kotkin's work for the past 30 years or so, and many more of us have been beneficiaries of his insights from since the conflict in Ukraine has started, and I'm one of them. And I'm grateful for his scholarship, and also that, and I look forward to his lecture. I can tell you one thing, and I can assure this part, is that we may not get answers to all the questions that we have, but we will certainly be getting out of this room a lot more well-informed and also perhaps better prepared to all those surprises that we might see and or otherwise the Russia might have for the future. So that I can assure you. And then it's just a matter of 1 hour for us, but then certainly you know that we are being enlightened by one of the foremost geopolitical thinkers in the world today. Thank you, Professor Kotkin, for coming. And seriously, I don't really want to be in the middle of you and what promises to be a very fascinating conversation between Professor Kotkin and Professor Mehta. Just a quick one on that is that you all know, because Rahul has introduced them, Pratap is a PhD from Princeton, also teaches at Princeton. And Professor Kotkin, yes, is a professor emeritus from Princeton. So basically, you're talking about two finest minds from Princeton for you today. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. Perhaps, would you like to? Over to you, Rahul. Thank you. Can I invite Professor Kotkin and Professor Mehta onto the dais? Over to you.
Okay. So I may need the microphone. So I can. If you want to, you like smoke with water. We don't have a wireless mic. Walking mic. You have the microphone. They'll get you a walking microphone. So if you want to walk around. So while we are waiting for the walking microphone, I think we kind of we'd anticipated Professor Kotkin either standing or sitting, but I'd forgotten he's a natural teacher and likes to walk around. Just want to add my personal thanks to Stephen Kotkin for doing this. And I want to say something particularly for those of the younger members of this audience. If you want to see what greatness in a historian and the model of scholarship looks like, I just advise you to read every one of Professor Kotkin's book. The book that first made him famous, The Magnetic Mountain, Stalinism as Civilization. It's a truly astonishing book. It has the anthropologist's gift of empathy, a strategic thinker's gift of thinking about hard politics, an economist's sense of political economy, a theorist's sense of what the big questions are. It's a model of how you actually combine so many disciplinary perspectives so coherently together. It's truly, I'd recommend it as a model. The second thing I want to say about Professor Kotkin, of course, is that apart from being one of the greatest living historians, he's one of the finest minds on contemporary strategic affairs. He has almost a parallel career thinking about international relations. For those of you who hear his podcasts, his foreign affairs pieces, he's far ahead of the curve. And the third and most important thing for this audience, in my years of interaction with American academia, I have not found a better friend for India than Stephen Kotkin, who, as a matter of institution building and scholarship, has done much to further Indian studies, but who has had India's interest in his heart. And like all good friends always worry about friends and criticize them as well. But Professor Kotkin is one of India's best friends in academia in the truest sense of that term. So we're deeply grateful to have you. Stephen, over to you. If you want to walk around or...
Who is this person?
Yes.
I don't know. Well, I don't recognize this person that you're describing, but thank you so much for that. Would it be okay if I walked around a little bit?
Yeah.
I'm vaccinated. I've had 4 shots from the COVID, and I fixed my breath just in case I get too close. Are there any more seats for the standing people that they could take? Okay.
Good.
I don't want people to be more uncomfortable than they are already. Are we able to hear me?
Yes.
Better? Yes. Well, when I invited myself to speak here tonight, I was very pleased that the Center for Policy Research graciously accepted my invitation to speak. So thank you to the leadership here for that. My first visit to India was 1991, a long time ago. Haven't been often enough, but I go back a ways. And my impression is that it's been darkest night here for a really long time, because India has grown so much in those 30 years. I read once that India grows at night. So it's been very impressive to see the growth. And it must be darkest night for 30 years now. There's a talk on China that you're not attending. I had hoped to attend it, but it turned out my talk was same time. So it's clear that Russia and China are dividing India again this evening. Sad. Very sad about that. You know, speaking about the future is dangerous. We don't know it very well. In fact, if I knew the future, I would be supporting CPR philanthropically rather than trying to make a speech. Sadly. But what history does for the future, well, there are 3 dimensions of history that I think are important that you know well. The first is that strategic empathy, to understand, not necessarily to validate, but to understand at the deepest possible level. Strategic empathy. A feeling or an understanding also, the second point, of perverse and unintended consequences, where you think you're doing one thing, but you achieve something sometimes entirely the opposite, but often different from what you intend, perverse and unintended consequences. Important. And the third is trying to get outside of the conjuncture or the epoch that you live in order to make your judgments, such that you can't ever escape your conjuncture, the epoch you live in. But attempting to do that enables you to potentially make judgments that are more enduring, rather than tied to specific events, specific people, specific institution of your own time period. And so this combination of strategic empathy, feeling for paradox or perverse and unintended consequences, and then finally trying to be, at least attempting to be, less tied to the current conjuncture, so that things that you say may endure, whereas the conjuncture won't endure. That's what history teaches you, that the present will not last. Okay. So that's a minor excuse for why I may talk about the future a little bit, because history can be quite helpful. It doesn't tell you what the future is, nothing does, but enables you to see some of the longer-term trends and some of the big drivers of change, and therefore some of the possibilities of the future. All right. So for that as the preface, I can state immediately that no country has done more for India than Russia. Russia showed India the profound moral squalor and murderousness of communism. That is a gift that nobody else could have delivered on the scale that the Soviet Union delivered, of course, until now. That lesson maybe wasn't learned as early and as quickly as by everyone, but it is a really important lesson. In 1928, when Joseph Stalin took a trip to Siberia to give a speech about the collectivization of agriculture, or if you prefer, the enslavement of the peasantry, 1% of the arable land in the Soviet Union was collectivized voluntarily. Voluntarily collectivized 1%. The peasants who couldn't farm had gone into collectives. In order to collectivize agriculture, you needed such massive coercive force because people would not give up their property voluntarily. This episode, you know how it unfolded. 5 to 7 million people died of starvation. 50 million people starved and survived. That's what happens, in fact. 50 million people of 170 million, more or less, starved and survived, meaning they didn't perish, but they starved for multiple years between 1931 and 35. So this is an enduring lesson, that if you want to impose some version of anti-capitalism or socialism, you need a level of coercion, and it has consequences that maybe you don't intend. It was only with the collectivization of agriculture that the Soviet Union's secret police grew to a scale that was terrifying. It had been a small organization relative to the population before the peasants were forced into the collectives, which was the way that they grew this gigantic repressive apparatus. Anyway, so that was a lesson delivered by the Soviet Union for you. A second lesson, gift that Russia gave you, is to show you what it means to be a vassal of China. That's a gift that's been delivered to you more recently. And we're not done understanding the implications of that. If you potentially underestimate Chinese power and Chinese intentions, you don't read the Chinese documentation, you don't see what their internal speeches are, you don't take note of their behavior in multiple places, including at home, the Russians are helping you understand what this could potentially look like. That deep level of dependency, which is predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly one way. So that's another gift, another lesson that Russia has done for India, and that's why I say it's done more for India than any other country in the world. What might be the future of Russia? When I sent the potential title for this crazy presentation, there was a question mark at the end, which I see didn't make it onto the poster. Because the future is yet to be invented, and the future is plural, and that includes Russia's futures. We see a pattern in Russia now for at least 300 years. The pattern doesn't mean it's identical in each epoch. It doesn't mean Russia doesn't change. It changes quite substantially. Russia is one of the major world civilizations, and it is just awesome to behold their achievements in art, music, dance, architecture, and I could go on. It's impossible to imagine world civilization without the civilization that we know as Russia. But on the political side and the geopolitical side, there's a pattern. And the pattern looks like this. Russia has aspirations to be a power of the first rank. It wants to be, if not the greatest power in the world, certainly one of the few great powers in the world. It's not an aspiration that Russia has by itself, but it is an abiding aspiration among Russian elites for many centuries now. The challenge is that the capacities, the capabilities of Russia don't match the aspirations. It is a power that is not always able, in capability terms, to be a power of the first rank, if not the great power in the world. There are three peaks of Russian power. Peter the Great's victory over Charles XII in Sweden, which implanted Russia on the Baltic Sea. A declining Sweden, a rising Russia. After that peak, Russia had many difficulties, although still remained an important imperial power. The second peak was, of course, much larger, and that was the defeat over Napoleon when Alexander got to Paris, presided over, importantly, the settlement of the defeat of Napoleon in France. And the third peak was, of course, the victory over Hitler in 1945, when Stalin got to Berlin. And they got off the train, and the American ambassador congratulated Generalissimo Marshal Stalin for reaching Berlin. And Stalin said to him, Alexander got to Paris. Honest to God statement. We have multiple sources confirming this. So besides those three peaks, Russia has often experienced difficulties, as I said, matching its aspirations. And so what happens as a result of this gulf, this gap, between its own capabilities and its aspirations? You could also call it a gap between Russian power and the greatest powers in the world, whether you define that as the West or some other coalition. You see them trying to manage this gap between their own aspirations and capabilities, or between their own power and the greater powers. You see them trying to manage this with the state as the predominant instrument, and coercive power to force modernize Russia in order to catch up both to its own aspirations and those greater powers, or at least to manage that gap. You can't necessarily catch up, but maybe you can manage it. So you have aspirations, capabilities that don't match them, and the state as an instrument coercively to try to catch up or at least manage the gap. And then you often get a growth spurt. You often get the state forcing the country into this modernization, which produces a temporary growth spurt that can be very impressive. And then they hit a wall. And the growth stops, and there's a devolution, a turning in on itself sometimes. And ironically, instead of getting a strong state, which is the goal of investment in the state as an instrument to force modernize, to try to close the gap, instead of getting a strong state, they get personalistic rule. They get personalistic rule, which conflates the survival of the country with the survival of that particular regime. Again and again and again. There's a version under the czars, there's a version under the communists, and there's a version today. It's not identical to repeat. This is not the same in every epoch. The current administration in Russia is not the same as the Soviet Union. Many of you know, having traveled there and seen with your own eyes, both the Soviet case and the Russian case today. And yet there's a remarkable pattern, even if there are important differences, of aspirations, exceeding capabilities, forced modernization with the state, and then personalistic rule, and this conflation, so that the regime's survival is the country's survival. The irony of this pattern is that it doesn't close the gap with the West. It doesn't close the gap between capabilities and aspirations. The irony of this attempt to close that gap is that it widens the gap again and again and again. So that instead of Russia's capabilities reaching its aspirations, instead of Russia becoming as powerful as the most powerful country or countries in the world, there's a slide. And Russian power is undermined by this very attempt to make it stronger. Again, perverse and unintended consequences. And so this is a geopolitical game, the costs of which are paid by the civilian population in Russia, as well as occasionally, and in some cases not too occasionally, Russia's neighbors. But as high a price as the neighbors pay, it's Russia's own population that often pays a higher price. Today, Russia's economy is predominantly a commodity exporter and a military-industrial complex. It has enormous dependencies. It's a technology desert at home. It doesn't produce 21st century technology to the degree that you would expect of a country with an economy that size. Russia's new economy, its private IT sector, is in exile, not entirely, but predominantly. You can find it in Tel Aviv. You can find it in Yerevan. You can find it in Dubai. And you can find it at Stanford University, where I now work. Russia's level of robotization, which is critical for any country with a declining birth rate and a shrinking population, is among the lowest in the world. The fiscal situation is complex, inflation is complex, but it's really hemorrhaging human capital, hemorrhaging some of your most talented people, whether they leave of their own accord or they're forced out. That is a very high cost to pay if you want to be a great power, as Russia does and has been. And so I look at Russia's trajectory, and as someone who's devoted his life to that remarkable civilization, it's very painful. It's very painful to see this conflation between the regime and the survival of this glorious civilization, which is a false conflation. This hemorrhaging of human capital, their best people. This reliance on commodity exports since the 18th century. It used to be grain, now it's hydrocarbons. And this highly repressive regime at home, there's no other way to describe it objectively. The costs of that, and why is that necessary? Why impose those costs on your own people as well as your neighbors? Why hemorrhage your human capital instead of investing in it? Why chase your 21st century economy abroad rather than develop it at home? And I could go on. I could make many other and deeply empirical statements about what's going on. I don't think this point is controversial, but if it turns out to be for you, we'll have a discussion for sure in the time that remains. So I see the trajectory that Russia is on, and it's the trajectory that hasn't worked again and again and again. And yet it's the trajectory that they persistently, stubbornly, if you will, continue to pursue from the top. And it has not ended well previously, and we'll see how this one's going to come out. Because I have to tell you, even Joseph Stalin proved to be mortal. He's not with us anymore. And so the leaders that pursue this policy are not always around when the consequences and the legacies continue to be felt. The choices that they make are choices for generations. So what we have with Russia is a couple of possibilities. One, Russia could become like France. That is to say, a country that had a monarchy, a revolution that was bloody and messy over multiple generations, a threat to its neighbors, like Napoleon was, and then it's transformed as a country. And France has assimilated its monarchy as a republic. It still venerates its monarchical traditions, but is now a stable republic. Its revolution is over and also assimilated into its contemporary politics in a way that's not destabilizing, and it no longer threatens its neighbors. And so I regard this as the best possible outcome of all the countries in the world that you would say are closest to Russia, and not only because of the shared cultural ties over several centuries where the Russian elite, as you know, in the 18th century spoke French. It's the closest country in the world in some ways to Russia, but it has relinquished its desire to be the first ranked power in the world. France has. And it's assimilated some of its more difficult traditions, and it's become a rule of law, stable country, friendly towards its neighbors, still full of pride, deservedly so. France is a great country. That would be a good outcome. To get to that outcome, you can think about the difference between France and Russia today. That's the difference that would have to be tracked. It's an enormous difference, but if France could do it, why not Russia? Again, there are tremendous differences between the countries. Their geography is different. How long the monarchy lasted is different. I'm not suggesting that this is easy or identical trajectory pathway, but I'm saying that it can teach us something about Russia's possible future. The other ones involve continuing on the path that it's on, playing this geopolitical game the way it's been played now for multiple centuries. And the consequences of that are pretty clear. Cut off from European contacts for the most part. Russia has never prospered outside of close ties to Europe. Never. Maybe it will in the future, but it's never happened. It would be unprecedented. But what's the way back to Europe? Poland is now in the EU and NATO. You no longer can jump over Eastern Europe and cut a deal with the Germans in some Ostpolitik fashion. Now the Poles and the Balts and the Swedes, and they're all inside. So the way back to Europe for Russia is now harder than ever. So burning those bridges was more profound than people understand. Without Europe, no obvious example of prosperity in Russian history, and with Europe now, hard to imagine given what's happened. So therefore, the future that we see in front of us is the one where you become more and more dependent on China for your technology transfer, but the Chinese will give you only what they'll give you. It's not an open relationship where you can buy what you want or build what you want. And so this deepening dependency on China, which Russia portrays as strategic autonomy, I know that word has resonance here. This deepening dependence on China, which Russia portrays as strategic autonomy, is quite troubling. You can see in the Russian social media, on the Telegram channels and elsewhere, complaints about Chinese manufacturing taking over the Russian domestic market, edging out Russian domestic production. The Russians lost most of their domestic automobile manufacturing. China now sells the cars there. And that trajectory is visible across civilian industry more and more and more. Approximately 90%, certainly at least 70% of Russian semiconductors imported from China. And I could go on. So that dependency is a one-way dependency. And the thing about China is they decide whether you're their vassal or not. You don't decide that. And so the relationship with China is not a treaty relationship. It's not something of mutual obligation. And the Chinese can change their mind on supporting Russia's trajectory. And then what? Where else do you turn? So unless we see a remarkable dramatic transformation domestically, where we can see a French version of Russia, again, an enormously successful and prideful country, and we worry about seeing that because of the change in the European membership. We're seeing Russia as dependent on China in a one-way trajectory. Now, of course, the more you depend on somebody else, the more potentially they're on the hook because of you. So, for example, if I owe you $100 and I can't pay it, I'm in trouble. But if I owe you $100 million and can't pay it, you're in trouble. That's your problem. And so we see more and more of this, the increasing dependency of Russia on China, ironically, is creating issues for China to manage. China, as you know, will not allow it to import more than 20% of any strategic material, including hydrocarbons, from any one country. So we see them not going above a certain limit in the dependency on Russia, with Russia going all the way in on the dependency on China. But there is this North Korean dimension to this, by which I mean this $100 versus $100 million. So the North Koreans know that the Chinese regime cannot give up on North Korea, because China does not want to lose the Korean War, which is not over yet. And if they gave up on North Korea and the North Korean regime collapsed, if China stopped supporting North Korea and North Korea imploded and South Korea was left to unify the country and pick up the bill, MacArthur would be on the Chinese border, effectively, many years after he died. And so China would lose the Korean War, which they're not going to do. And so therefore, the regime in Pyongyang, the Kim dynasty, can get away with many things that the Chinese don't like, even though they have a 90% dependency on China. So this is where Russia's moving a little bit, doing things that maybe the Chinese don't fully approve, while being more and more dependent. Again, the Russians portray this as their strategic autonomy in world affairs, as being a pole in a multipolar world. By multipolar world, they mean multiple coercive spheres of influence that they impose on their neighbors and others. That's a multipolar world. Okay. Anyway, so we could go on, but you see the picture. It's worrisome, at least to a person like me, who has been to that country on and off since 1984, lived many, many years there, and is highly enamored of that culture and civilization. All right, let me talk a little bit about world order. How are we doing on time?
We have time. We have plenty of time.
I violated the
No,
time.
there's lots of time. Please, 20 minutes or so.
I won't talk about the domestic politics in the United States because I don't have that level of comedic ability. I'll skip over that, but that's certainly fair game for discussion in the Q&A. Just alerting people.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the future of world order. So let's imagine that you were alive in 1974. I'm looking out here and seeing that for most people that's not the case. You weren't around in 1974, but some of us were. And let's imagine we were alive and we fell asleep. We fell asleep in 1974, And we woke up today. We're trying to follow the cricket, various marriages of the Bollywood and the Tollywood. What would be surprising if you fell asleep in 1974 and you woke up 50 years later? What would be comprehensible and what would be incomprehensible? Well, if you were around in 1974, you would have been witnessing the self-destruction of U.S. soft power. President Nixon's resignation, the loss of the war in Vietnam after America committed countless atrocities there, the Rust Belt, the horrific hollowing out of all those communities that had been based upon heavy industry because of the oil crisis, disco, that's probably the worst phenomenon of the 70s, or at least in my memory. Donna Summer and John Travolta and all of that rubbish. It was grim. And then you would see the recuperation of American soft power. You would see America's economy maintain its position as more or less 1/4 of global GDP, the same as it was in the 1880s through today, more or less 1/4, give or take, of global GDP. Just an astonishing number. 5% of global population, 25% of global GDP, and 50% of global military, and higher if you count quality rather than just quantity. But there'd be something that would be very familiar, which is that there's this Eurasian autocracy that's arrayed against American power. And this Eurasian autocracy that's arrayed against American power, its anti-Americanism, is core to the survival of it as a regime and as in its own mind a great power. And back then it was the Soviet Union, and today it's Russia. And back then, China was a junior partner for a time in this Eurasian opposition to America. And now China's, of course, the senior partner, which wouldn't surprise you if you've studied history the way India has a history, that is to say, multiple millennia, that China is on top and Russia is subordinate. But nonetheless, you'd see a Eurasian land power, an autocracy, arrayed against the United States. And the United States trying to rally friends and partners and treaty allies to stand up against this perceived hostility. And so it turns out that if you had fallen asleep in 74 and woken up today, the world would look very familiar to you. Geopolitically, the world has changed much less than we think it has. It's barely changed at all. In 74, you would have been aware of Bandung and the non-alignment movement, and how it didn't work. Because China and India didn't see eye to eye. And you have the same quest for non-alignment now, and the same issues about how to align in non-alignment. Because you don't have alignment in non-alignment. So geopolitically, the world to me looks like it was when I fell asleep in 74. So what, if anything, has changed, and what are the implications of that change? Let me spend a minute or two on that. What's changed is everything is interconnected now. Everything is interconnected. Now the refrigerator in my house, which is known as a smart refrigerator, can conduct surveillance on my life at home. And our friends in Russia or China can penetrate my home through my refrigerator, or my phone, or all my other smart devices that make me incredibly vulnerable in ways that I had never been. This interconnectivity is not going away, and it's enormously destabilizing. Sure, it's very empowering for young people to walk around with a supercomputer in their pocket. But it's also very destabilizing. It makes you vulnerable to some 15-year-old who hasn't seen a bottle of shampoo, maybe ever, and has a piece of equipment that can turn off your electrical system, not just in your home, but in the country. How did that happen? That's a much bigger change than anything that happened in geopolitics. A second gigantic change in our world since 1974 is that everything is so-called dual use. Dual use. What do I mean by that? Back when I was growing up, there was something called the military-industrial complex. And it was a place, and you could go there. And so when our distinguished scientists from the Soviet Union came to the United States on the academic exchange, the great mathematicians and physicists, Nobel Prize winners, extraordinary people, and we wanted them in our laboratories because of their unmatched skill in the sciences and mathematics. But there were places inside our universities or our laboratories that they couldn't go, that were off limits to them, because they were connected to the military-industrial complex. And so if those distinguished scientists, visitors, tried to get into the laboratories that were close to them, there would be a huge scandal and they'd be sent home. Now, there's nothing like that. You see, because every laboratory is dual use. Every technology has military applications. There's no military-industrial complex separate from the civilian economy anymore. This is the military-industrial complex. Software, material science, bioengineering, all the things that we're hoping can transform our lives in positive ways, and I think they will. All of those things are now capable of doing extraordinary damage in the hands of someone you perceive or acts as your adversary. How do you manage that? You can't. You're trying to create a small yard with a high fence to try to block your adversaries from acquiring your technology, and it's a small yard with a high fence and a gigantic front door that's wide open. And so I don't know how you manage that. That's also massively destabilizing and much bigger than any of the geopolitical changes. A third enormous change is that China has become synonymous with economic opportunity. For almost all of my adult life, the United States was synonymous with economic opportunity. Security and economic opportunity combined. Sure, it was also synonymous in many people's minds with imperialism, with domestic unrest. Again, I lived through the 70s. Nobody has to tell me what American domestic politics and American domestic institutions and shortcomings and failures look like. I know them firsthand. And also, I'm from a working class family. My father worked in a factory. But strikingly, today, China is synonymous with economic opportunity, still even now, after its economy hit a wall 15 years ago. And it's being artificially inflated first with the housing bubble, and now with other techniques like massaging the statistics or classifying the statistics. So China became a manufacturing superpower, and the United States declined in that space. That, by the way, was done on purpose, voluntarily. And so the U.S. can't produce ships, and the world is an ocean. Yeah. So I wouldn't have done that, but then again, I'm not very close to power. So that's a bit, and I'll give you the fourth and final of the many that I could say that are the changes, and that's borders of defeat. Borders of defeat. What do I mean, borders of defeat? You see, the Soviet Union's borders were borders of victory. all those sacrifices in the war, in partnership with the United States and the UK, those amazing sacrifices that the Soviets undertook under Stalin's rule, 27 million lives, resulted in borders of victory. The Soviet Union was in Berlin. The Soviet Union had satellites across Eastern Europe. In addition to Mongolia, the North Korean case, these are borders of victory. And the Soviets could become a status quo power. You see, when you have borders of victory, you can enter into all sorts of negotiations to stabilize the world order because you're part of a world order in which you have borders of victory. So the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, which we remember as an agreement about human rights, the Soviets recognized the universality of human rights in the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, which was then used against the Soviet regime by the dissident movement. But what they got in exchange was recognition of their post-World War II borders. So for us, it was a human rights treaty. For them, it was a border recognition treaty. And they became a stabilizing force in many ways in the international order. Today, we have borders of defeat. This is deep and profound. Crimea, Ukraine, borders of defeat for Russia. Israel, borders of defeat for Iran and the Palestinian Arabs. Taiwan, borders of defeat in the perception of the current mainland Chinese regime. The 1949 Civil War is not finished yet from their point of view. Taiwan is a government in exile. That's how it originated, and that's what it is now. And so how do you stabilize relations with borders of defeat? Yes, very hard. Very hard, because their stake in the existing international order is not just that they're anti-American, that they don't like American power, that they're civilizations predating the existence of America and don't resent America being in charge, which anybody could understand that resentment. But it's deeper than that. The borders of defeat, not borders of victory like in the Soviet Union. So stabilizing relations in some way, is it possible? Until they change those borders to borders of victory. And if they do change those borders to borders of victory, what are the repercussions and the implications of that going forward? We could talk about Hungary and borders of defeat. Yeah. Hungary was Slovakia. Hungary was Serbia. Hungary was most of Romania. There's none of that now. Borders of defeat. We see some of the consequences of this in Hungary's domestic politics. We could talk about Turkey and borders of defeat. And I could go on, you get the point. That's much bigger than the geopolitical changes that supposedly have happened. They may yet happen. We may yet live to see them. Okay, let me conclude with a few remarks about India. Here I know even less than the other subjects I've been speaking about. So the level of absurdity will be even higher now. But I would like to engage the room on those first two themes, but also on this third theme to help educate me. We have in America often idiot savants who speak about the rise of India. I hear this phrase all the time, the rise of India. I was at the Taj Mahal yesterday, not for the first time. I was at Mahabalipuram 3 days ago. And so phrases like the rise of India are just laughable to me. Sure, in the past few centuries. There has been a geopolitical order. It's a blip in historical time, and certainly there's a US-led international order more recently, which is the lifetime of most of our idiot savants, talking about the rise of India. So we need a better vocabulary. We can't be talking about the rise of India. Otherwise, we look even stupider and more condescending than is true in reality, which is really saying something. Nobody plays a strong hand worse than the Americans. Nobody, because nobody's had a hand that strong, ever. How to understand India, India's power, India's position. So superficially, this is what I see. I see 6 million Indian diaspora in the United States. More or less 6 million. And I see them in remarkable positions of power and authority. I'm now in Silicon Valley, which this is the uniform they gave me when I showed up. It's my California outfit, not my Princeton dark suit. And I see them there, and they are not just the most successful people, they are the decision makers. They are making decisions for the United States in many different spheres. Of course, in the high-tech sphere, most prominently, but not only. And then I go to the Emirates and the Gulf in general. And it's not 6 million, it's 9 million. And I see the same phenomenon there. I see mass labor at the manual entry level, of course, in the Gulf. But I also see Indians in positions of power and authority because of the companies that they're founding or already founded. And so I see Indian power already. And I see it growing and growing and growing. There are two things that are always true about an American embassy abroad. One, there's an anti-American demonstration of huge proportions outside the embassy. And two, there's the longest queue for visas you have ever seen. Except for the next embassy, which is
Longest wait time.
sadly. And so that queue for visas is full of talented people from here, including people who go back and forth. And so Indian power is here, and it's here right in our own places, whether you talk about the Gulf or you talk about the United States. But what is that Indian power going to look like emanating from here? I know what it looks like in Silicon Valley and across the United States, in New Jersey, where I founded a Center for Global India, and we discovered the size of the community there surrounding Princeton University. And in the Gulf, as I said, extraordinary, the achievements and the size. And it's only going to grow. And I don't know East Africa, but maybe if I went to East Africa, I would feel the same. Two things that stand out in terms of Indian power emanating from here. Again, I said it was going to be superficial, and I'm going to keep that promise. One, how are you going to manage American power? How are you going to manage American power? What are you going to do with American power? American power is the most powerful instrument available to you. There is no instrument more powerful. You can ask the Chinese what they did with American power. They used it for an economic boom, the likes of which we haven't seen since America's original economic boom. What are you going to do with American power? How are you going to manage it? And I find that the answer is not there yet. And what are you going to do about Chinese power? What are you going to do about Chinese power? Because that's not going away. They play for keeps, as you know. These are things that everyone in this room knows better than I do. American power and Chinese power. But for me, strikingly, I don't understand the answers emanating from here. I understand what the answers look like in Abu Dhabi, what they look like in Palo Alto, what they look like surrounding Princeton University. But here I'm not sure. And unless there are persuasive answers to those two questions, then I'm not sure that India's role, India's place, India's potential, India's trajectory will meet the expectations of the people in this room and the people more broadly in the society. This room is full of people, former ambassadors, former ministers, current ambassadors, academics, distinguished guests. You look at this room and you say, yes, it's here. Indian power is here. It's a reality. It's not something that's coming. It's here. But what are your answers for American power and for Chinese power? How are you going to manage those relationships in ways that redound successfully to India, not just in the conjuncture, but generationally? Those are really big. America has 80 treaty, almost 80 treaty obligations voluntarily entered into by other countries. China has a treaty with North Korea, which is full of mutual obligations if they trust each other to do that. The U.S., almost 80 treaties like this, relationships. Is that on the cards? And if that's not on the cards, what is? And on the Chinese side, that discussion about vassalhood and about bringing to heel, that's the plan. They talk about this openly. They're not ashamed to discuss it in these terms. And they're going to do it. Or at least they're going to try. So what's the answer? Anyway, so I have some sense of Russia's trajectory. Maybe you disagree. I have some sense of the world order being very similar to the one 50 years ago in terms of geopolitics, but profoundly different in terms of the technology, the integration, the destabilization of dual use, and this problem of borders of defeat. But I have less clear sense on the India side, even though I see and feel Indian power everywhere I go, including here. Anyway, thank you for your attention.
So, as we had expected, that was a tour de force. I think this lecture will be discussed in Delhi for a very long time and actually may shape some of the answers that we come up with to the questions you pose. So, thank you so much. So what I'll do, since there's so many interesting, all of you are in the audience very patiently, is rather than have a conversation with Stephen, because we have spoken many times, and I think he'd love to hear from you, I'll just begin off the discussion with maybe a couple of small questions, just so that we can make sure that more of you can participate, because I think that'll be much more interesting for Stephen than me. I mean, there's always lots of questions to ask him and back and forth. So let me just to kick off the discussion, I mean, just as a kind of opening thought, pick up on something you said very, very profound. You said many profound things, but one thing in particular, which is this idea of defeated borders. And actually, many would argue that in some senses, that's also complex, that subconsciously actually pervades India as well in a different kind of way, that the sundering of the strategic unity of the subcontinent, at least, if not its literal borders. And that's partly the answer why we can't actually make up our mind in some senses, because you're in two mindsets. On the one hand, you do have a sense of defeated border syndrome. On the other hand, you have this extraordinary opportunity in the world, kind of, I think, awaiting you.
Yes.
But the question I wanted to ask, particularly since you know Russia and China very well, which is, so in the 1980s, 1990s, there was this hope that yes, these defeated borders are kind of historical facts, but one way we manage them is to throw cold water over them, which is, I mean, in a way, that was the strategy. We don't really resolve this issue. But we try and create a world where the stakes in overcoming those defeated borders become less and less in some ways. They just become matters of fact. I mean, Taiwan's there,
Yes.
kind of Russia's there. And it seemed like for a while that we were heading in that direction. I mean, if you look at dominant discussions of international relations, in particular, this idea that territory no longer matters as much as one aspect of that, right? What happened in the last 15, 20 years that this idea of defeated borders, which, you know, in many of these countries have created modus vivendi. I mean, Turkey, modern nation state, we thought it was not going to, in some senses, try and recreate the Ottoman Empire or Russia greater. What's your diagnosis? What happened that this idea of defeated borders has, in some senses, become a kind of pervasive sensibility? And as you rightly said, I agree with you. I think one of the principal sources of potential instability in the world.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a very difficult question, as you would expect. It's been less surprising to me what's happened in the world. I was not of the opinion that we had transcended a great power rivalry. People said that, return of geopolitics. And I said, well, what have I been doing for 30 years? It just returned now? For 30 years, I've been discussing this. I gave the Borders of Defeat lecture at Princeton University as a junior faculty member as part of my course. So there's something to explain, but I think there were delusions, self-created delusions about how the world supposedly works that were never really true. You have unaccountable elites in liberal democratic orders. This is a subject you know better than I do. And those unaccountable elites continued to impose high costs on their people and never be punished for them. Most recently, it was the U.S. Intervention in Iraq, the euro in the European Union case, when that was introduced, the global financial crisis, which was a gift of the United States, which the rest of the world was on the receiving end for the most part, not exclusively, but. And after every one of those catastrophes, and there were others that preceded that, global elites only did better and better and better. Their assets grew, their speaking fees grew, they instituted all of these fabulous conclaves in Davos or wherever. And so this Davoisie of unaccountable elites across borders made some really big mistakes and paid no price. And that's been accumulating. And they deserve to be held accountable. But how do democratic systems hold them accountable? That's one piece of it. The other piece is the social media piece. So when I was growing up, if you were a member of a right-wing militia in the United States, you had a typewriter, and you typed out your newsletter with carbon paper. You had 5 copies, and you mailed one to a friend in Utah, and you mailed another to a friend in Idaho, and you told them to pass it on. Now, you have a Facebook page. you're a right-wing militia with a Facebook page. And you know every single member of the community everywhere. And you can get them all to come collectively. You can overcome the collective action problem. Let's call that January 6th, 2021 in the United States, which is a Facebook page, social media overcoming the collective action problem. Every single militia member in the United States who wasn't in jail was there in DC, all few thousand of them. It's a 340 million person country, and there's a few thousand militia members, and they have a Facebook page or several Facebook pages. So everyone becoming their own publisher, empowering people who had no voice. They had those same thoughts, the conspiratorial mentality, and I could go on. But now they're publishers, and no one can prevent them from disseminating this view. And in fact, they can enhance the size of their community as well as the dissemination of the views. That's just extraordinary. And that's new, relatively recent, and it's a bigger issue than we took it to be when it first happened. And so between the unaccountability of the elites, which is never a good idea in any system, especially in a democratic one, the empowerment that social media delivered, all you were left waiting for was some political entrepreneurialism. And the political entrepreneurialism, given that high level of demand, was eventually supplied. And so on the political entrepreneurial side, there's a formula. It's a kind of what we call paint by the numbers. When you're young and you get a coloring book and you're not sure how to draw or paint the object, you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, you paint by the numbers and you get the peacock. So the paint by the numbers is pretty simple. Internal enemies, external enemies. Could it be Roma or gypsies? Could it be Muslims? Could it be elites? Could it be George Soros? It could be all of that. It's a full package, and you can continually generate resentment, anger, because the elites are making mistakes and unaccountable, and because you're a publisher and nobody can stop you. And so that combustibility, which is partly technologically driven, partly politically driven, and partly necessary. I'm calling it necessary as a corrective, right? The United States just went through an election in which the Democratic Party was punished, and they were punished deservedly. And the voters in the voters booth can't get what they want, but they can punish what deserves to be punished. And the vehicle for that was, of course, this phenomenon known as Trump. And so that political entrepreneurialism plus the social media plus the unaccountable elites, right? That's a cocktail, as we call it. And there's a version of that everywhere and anywhere. The recourse to identity politics, the divisiveness, the us versus them, the enemies within and without combining. And then, of course, a scapegoat for everything and anything, because you can't fix it despite your promises. And your scapegoats are right at hand. You have nothing but scapegoats. And when you say, well, that's a tired scapegoat, you have new ones that you can find. And so that formula, right, on top of the immigration stuff, on top of global integration with no global governance, and I could go on, right? All the things that we saw after the globalization of the 19th century, which didn't end well. It ended very badly. It ended in not just anti-immigration, but world wars and Great Depression. So we haven't approached anything like that level of horror, and of course, we all hope we won't. But the phenomenon is not such a big surprise to a person like me, and we were living it without acknowledging it. And now people are saying, how did that happen? When it was happening, and in fact, the people asking how did that happen, they're the cause.
Yeah.
They're the driver.
Fine. So we'll open it up. If you could keep your questions or comments brief so that we can get as many as possible in the time available. Professor Pallat, yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think there's a mic coming. Just 1 second. Yeah, yeah. So you can hear the question. Yeah, yeah. Please
Very
go ahead.
good.
Yeah.
Come to the Russia part of your lecture, the first part. The burden of your point was that Russians' leaderships are irrational, always aspiring to do something that is beyond their capacity. And then you pose the question, what makes them do so at such heavy cost? I didn't get the answer. I don't think you actually gave the answer there. And I would like to press you on that. Why would they follow this kind of a suicidal law, such a extreme policy throughout the centuries? The Russians themselves have an answer to that. They're aware of the costs that have been imposed upon themselves. In Peter the Great's time, it was to avoid dismemberment from the West.
Yes.
Poland had tried. Sweden is going to. At the end of the 18th century, before the revolution, it was a fear of becoming another underdeveloped economy or going down in the manner of the Ottoman Empire. And they had to impose very heavy costs for their industrialization at that time, as of that period, like the famine in 1890s. Again, in the 1930s, the fear of yet another dismemberment, which is very real and on the cards, and the forced collectivization and the enormous coercion in the costs. So when it came to 1990s, the expectation was that they would become something like a junior partner to the United States, equal or junior, somewhere, at least amongst the liberal intelligentsia who were prepared. They're prepared for a junior role. May not be Yeltsin or Gorbachev, but in effect. Now that is what is not an offer to them. They could not accept the position that Britain, France, Germany, and Japan did after the war. That was not offered to them. They were offered as, or what they saw was coming, seemed to be more like a Latin American position. Europe was built up as Fortress Europe, against something, the Soviet Union. Post-Soviet Russia could not be built up against anything. There's no reason to build it up. And obviously the United States is not going to help build it up to have the challenger come up again. So Russia was trapped. It can't develop the way it wanted as Europe did, because that is not coming to them. The only thing that could happen then was...
sorry to interrupt, but can you keep your question
Yeah.
brief so that we can get others?
So it looks like a tragedy which they could not escape. I'd like your comments on that.
I reject that 100%. So I didn't suggest that they are irrational. I suggest that they make choices. Choices imply that it's not the only pathway. No one has to murder 18 to 20 million people to modernize their country. That's what Stalin did. That's the reasonable estimate of how many people died from either direct execution, collectivization, famine, deportation. So it's not the war. You can modernize your country and manage the unsentimentalities of the world order multiple ways. Let's take the Japanese case. The United States shows up with ships uninvited in Tokyo Bay in the 1850s. And the Japanese response is, thank you for coming. We didn't invite you. Why don't you go home? We'll take care of our affairs ourselves, as we always have. And the Americans, they were SOBs. They didn't just go home. They said, well, in fact, we'd like to show you how to live. and benefit from that. And so the Japanese made a choice. And the Japanese choice was to figure out how to match American power. And so they sent a delegation, the famous Iwakura mission in the 1870s, to all the advanced countries to study the banking system, the education system, the general staff, the domestic political arrangements. It was like a supermarket of world institutions and power for the Japanese. So you like the Belgian banking system, you like the French educational system, you like the German general staff, you like the American banking system, you like the German version of the Constitution, or do you like the British version of the Constitution? And they made choices. And those choices were to incorporate those high-level Western institutions while remaining Japanese. And they succeeded, even though they were East Asian. And there was pervasive racism against an East Asian people to rise up and become part of the world order. In fact, they defeated Russia in a war, as you know, as well as I do, which was in some ways the announcement of their success, of that modernization choice that they made. They made a choice to adapt themselves to the Western order in order to survive. Not only did they survive, they prospered. Now, the Japanese and the Americans clashed in the Second World War. There was a 1941 moment, which the Chinese face today, which was a question of, can we be a great power in the European mold, like the British, without taking on American power in confrontational fashion? And they decided to do that. And it didn't work. They broke their teeth trying to garrison China, and the Chinese lost minimum of 13 million lives. And then they were overtaken by the superiority of American population, domestic production, and military sophistication on the battlefield. And then they made another choice. And they chose to be a junior partner in the American-led order. And they rose to be the second largest economy in the world, from ashes, from having been bombed with atomic weapons by the Americans. They accepted the role of junior partner to the Americans and made it work. They got full access to the American domestic market. They sold manufactured goods to the insatiable American middle class. They rose to be the second largest economy in the world, and they taught Deng Xiaoping what to do. And he looked over the water, and he said, this country was in ashes, Japan. They were defeated in the war, and they're rising to the second largest economy, and here in China, thanks to Mao, our per capita GDP is $200 a year. And Deng Xiaoping made the same choice that the Japanese made, which was gain access to the American domestic market, and through entrepreneurialism and the diligence, the unbelievable hard work and talent of your population, to rise up from nothing to become the second largest economy in the world. You can make a lot of choices when you have elites, and you can manage American power, and you can manage the world order. And you can manage it not once, but multiple times in the case of the Japanese. The Russians have not made those choices. They've made other choices. Rational or irrational, I don't use that vocabulary. They've made choices that Russia must be not only a great power, but a great power of the first rank, or it can't be Russia. Now that choice is again a choice that imposes those costs on the domestic population as well as their neighbors. There's another choice. I know because other countries have made those other choices. And so I don't think that Russia was trapped except by its own elites, except by its own choices. Of course, the world is brutal and unsentimental. And the Americans talk, like all hypocrites do, about an open global order and about equal sovereignty, and then the Americans behave the way they do. I know it just as well as you do. And yet, some countries figure out how to manage that. I could talk about the German case in West Germany. I could talk about many other cases. I could talk about Poland. Poland, which controlled an enormous size of Ukrainian territory, has no irredentist claims today on Ukrainian territory, and instead supports Ukraine in the war against Russia. Poland is one of the most successful countries in the world since 1989. They made choices there, and those choices were not preordained, and they were made by Polish elites with consensus in the society. And then Russia made choices too.
Why do Russia make those choices?
You'd have to ask them. I would like to know the answer. But they can make different choices, and if they did make different choices, they could manage world affairs. There's
Okay.
no doubt in my mind.
So we have lots of hands up, but very little time. So we'll try and get in a few questions, if you can be
We
brief.
see a
So
woman
yeah,
with
I've given track. So we'll begin with you, and then we'll go back there. I think you had a.
Thank you, Professor, for this insightful discussion. It's a great pleasure to listen to you in front of me. You have mentioned about the concept of border defeat. I think in the world of globalization, where borders are very porous, the technological advancements are so huge between the great powers. Do you think the border defeat is now becoming more technological driven and America is going to be defeated by the Chinese? When we see the concept of economic prosperity, we now think about the Chinese version of model development, technological innovation kind of things. What's your take on it? Thanks.
Yes, borders only ended rhetorically. They ended in journals about globalization. They ended at think tanks. They ended in op-ed pages of newspapers. They never ended in reality. You would know that if you had a passport and you were trying to move around in the world. Or if you didn't have a passport, you'd know it even more. It's just the idea that borders ended was just people who are part of the Davoisie can believe that. But ordinary people could never believe that. Well, another point, though, that you make on the technology and the role of technology in this question. So what technology has done is not made borders porous, it's made them indefensible. That's something that's really unusual in history. Right? You can go around India and you have these gigantic forts. They're extraordinary, whether they're sandstone or other colossi, and they have a moat around them. And it was pretty difficult to penetrate them. Sometimes they were taken, but you can see that there was a way to defend yourself and keep those things you didn't want in, keep them out. You can't do that now. Your refrigerator can be manipulated, as I said, across border. You can go home now and you can do things to my house that I can't necessarily control if you have the technical skill. And so that's very destabilizing. The loss of borders in a defensible sense, defensible borders, that's really extraordinary. But borders remain salient and will for the rest of certainly your lifetime.
Okay. Yes, sir. If you can be brief. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for putting together this event, and I thank Professor Kotkin for taking his time to be with us tonight. Vladimir Ladanov, Russian Embassy here. Now, Professor has painted a very dark, almost depressing picture of where Russia is today, especially of the Russian economy. And the beauty certainly is in the eye of the beholder. Now, let me put some things straight.
Very briefly, sir.
Very
Yeah.
briefly, sir,
Thank
and
you.
I
Thank you.
appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. No, exactly. That's why we asked him to.
Now,
Yeah. Absolutely.
Now, based on the World Bank data, Russia is classified as a high-income country. Russia's GDP per capita is nearly 40,000 US dollars. In terms of GDP, in terms of purchasing power parity, Russia ranks fourth, only behind China, the United States, and India. Well, that is something. So my point is that while we'll take note of your perspective, Professor, we should also be mindful of the fact that there are other views too. And in conclusion, following your command, Mr. Chairman, I would like to take this opportunity to assure you, sir, that Russia has no interest in penetrating your personal life through your smart refrigerator. I don't know whether it helps or not, but I felt bound to ask you of that. Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah, I wish that were
for
true.
raising the question.
I wish that were true. You should see the history of my laptop and phone. You know, so, and as far as Russian statistics go about its economy and its trajectory, God bless. God bless, I hope you're right. But I think the Soviet Union's economy was also rather large.
So I've been keeping track, and I'm so sorry. We won't be to take all of So
my
but
fault.
Please, no, it's one. Please.
Good evening. So I'm Zara Naqvi and I'm a lawyer. I have a question with you. What will be the stand of Russia in the current scenario where powerful countries suppressing small countries by supporting mass destruction and genocide in order to control over their resources, which consequently destroying the identity of that country? The point is to know where does the Russia stand?
Do you have one example in mind, or?
Just the current example of my question is the Syrian war.
Okay, Syria. No.
It's tragic what's happened to Syria. There's no other way to describe it. The number of people who've died, the number of people who've been displaced. I think you should ask our friends in the Russian government and those representing the Russian government. I think you should ask our friends in Iran and Hezbollah. I think you should ask many others besides me about that question. You know, the problem with world order is that it works for many countries, but not all. And the countries that it doesn't work for often experience horrors that are almost indescribable. That's Sudan, as well as Syria, Yemen, and I could give many other examples. Cold War was a fabulous thing because Cold War means no hot war. When you have great power rivalries, which are endemic to civilization, you have four options. Hot war, that's going to give you multiple tens of millions of deaths, maybe more. Appeasement or accommodation, or what I would call capitulation, that usually gives you war all the same. Pygmalion, George Bernard Shaw, that's where you think you're going to be able to transform somebody else's domestic political arrangements, their institutions from without. You're going to find a street urchin and transform her into a lady, like Pygmalion. That doesn't work. And so the fourth option, and there are only four in recorded history, between hot war, capitulation, which gives you hot war in the long term anyway, and Pygmalion, which never works as a self-delusion. The alternative is Cold War. And so Cold War is the most important, most stable, happiest solution in great power rivalry. The problem with Cold War is that it's hot war for many other countries in what's known as proxy war. And so I'm completely in favor of a Cold War between the United States and China, but very worried about the effects on those countries which don't have the kind of voice in the international system for all sorts of reasons, the ones that you referred to. And so it troubles me what you said very much, and I worry about more Syrias going forward.
So, in the interest of time, I'm sorry we won't be able to accommodate it. What we'll do is take, if it's okay with you, one last round of 3 very short questions.
You're in
if that's
charge.
Okay. No,
You
no, I
don't
mean,
need
if it's
my
time,
permission.
time. So, yes, you have the mic, sir.
this
But
is-
very
Nair,
brief. Right.
I am a newspaper columnist. My question is not as profound as the thoughts in your very scintillating lecture. As a historian, Professor Kotkin, I would like to ask you if Andrei Belousov, an economist, if he is the first economist to head the Russian military-industrial complex as defense minister, and if so, what are the implications of an economist and not a military man heading the Russian defense ministry for the future of Russia and extending it to the future of the world order?
Okay, if you could just pass the mic to your right, sir, quickly. And then.
My name is Dr. Sudhir Mishra.
Yes, sir.
I'm working in the DRDO. It's a defense organization.
Yes.
You see, you mentioned that now China has replaced Russia as a major superpower. Now, we have seen that the implication for India is that we have to balance China, and we feel that whosoever has in the past rather slept with US as far as the the countries in the Asia are concerned, they got destroyed, like Pakistan, finished almost. They fought on behalf of US in Afghanistan and to the Russians. So we are afraid that we also would be used in the supremacy in fighting with China. So what's your comments, please?
Okay, we'll take one last question. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, good evening. I'm Krishna Agarwal, currently pursuing Masters at Cambridge. So my question is that when I talk about history, it's completely based on narratives. And as Professor Dipesh Chakrabarti has pointed out, that sometimes we don't have a proper vocabulary to articulate what the exact history is. So when we talk about Russia, or even the example that you gave about Japan and China, how can we look at their history in isolation when the whole Western construct is being played in the background, in the sense that the idea of development, the idea of progress, all these ideas, the countries are being forced in the geopolitical context to actually aspire towards it. So is the problem exactly with the particular state, or the problem exists in the entire structural functionalist framework of the institutions, the international institutions?
Okay, it's a very big question too. And okay, I think. Okay, one last. Okay, just very quickly, please.
Good evening, sir. My name is Mohammad Faizi Khan. I want to ask a very small question. Sir, as Donald Trump said openly in the public that I am being supported by the Russian embassies in US elections. In previous election, he also said that by hook and crook, I won the election with the support of the Russians. So what is the reason behind it? What will be the consequences you are seeing in the future, sir? Thank you very much.
Okay, the Trump Russia. Okay, I'm so sorry. I mean, I wish we could continue for another couple of hours at least. You know, your questions and Professor Kotkin's answers are all absolutely wonderful, but we'll let you have the last word and the last laugh.
Seriously?
Yes, of course.
First of all, I thank everybody, and I apologize that I'm not succinct enough to enable everyone to ask a question.
Thank God for that.
I'm prolix on the page and in person. So this is very interesting about Belousov and the defense ministry. I agree with you. I think in light of what our ambassador from Russia had to say, he's right about the fact that Russia has a very well-managed macroeconomics. Russian politics is in some ways a battle between the security side of the regime, which is always enormous. They overinvest in the military, they overinvest in the secret police, and they give you this top-heavy, security-driven state, afraid of their own people, etc. But they also invest in the macroeconomics, in the finance ministry and in the banking sector. And so in many ways, Russian domestic politics is a rugby scrum between the security personnel and the economics finance personnel. The economics finance personnel are small in number relative to the security personnel, minuscule in number, but heavy in weight and of enormous sophistication. You know, until Gorbachev, the Soviet Union had a very well-managed external debt, and it had not lack of inflation, but manageable inflation, stable currency. Sure, it's manipulated, but they had a macroeconomic position domestically that many other countries would have envied. Gorbachev ruined it, but after Gorbachev it was fixed. It was very difficult. The 90s were terrible. But the macroeconomic stability, which happened under President Putin in his first term, was pretty extraordinary and continues to this day, despite the strain of the war, the international sanctions, the lack of sufficient labor, the import of all the most important technologies. Nonetheless, the macroeconomic hasn't blown up. Maybe it will, but it hasn't yet. And so seeing economists in power in Russia is not, whether it's in the defense ministry per se, but in the system, is not unusual. And it is a strength of the Russian system. Unlike the Ottoman system, as the good professor pointed out, which couldn't manage its finances, the Qing system couldn't manage its finances. Imperial Russia managed its finances, so it's a long-standing tradition. And so, yes, in the defense ministry per se, it's not a long-standing tradition, but in the system at large, it's pretty typical. You know, on Trump and support of Russia, I don't know what I'm going to be able to say about this. Trump is not in power in America because of Russia. Period. Trump is an American phenomenon like apple pie, like baseball, like I could go on. Trump is not an alien from somewhere else, and he's not a foreign implant. He's homegrown. And sure, tremendous hysteria in America over Russian interference in our elections. Because, you know, they spent $100,000 on Facebook ads. I mean, it's overblown. And many things one could say about Trump, but Russia did not cause him. And in many ways, Trump frustrated Russia in his first term. The Russians expected Trump to basically hand over American power, weaken NATO, hand over Ukraine. And Trump failed to deliver on the expectations, and there was considerable disillusionment, certainly in the government. I spoke with them firsthand about this. Trump was unpredictable, unmanageable, didn't meet his promises, so we'll see in the next term how it works out. I wouldn't put it past Putin to humiliate Trump and Trump to respond to any humiliation. Let me finish with the narratives of history and the China superpower for India. Historical narratives are really powerful. In fact, all narratives are powerful. Narratives are more powerful than secret police and guns, ultimately. Sure, you can get pretty far with the secret police and armed forces, but they can switch sides. They can withdraw their support. They can mutiny. They can cause an internal coup if your narrative has failed. Opportunism is not enough for any country, any regime, no matter how despotic, including Stalin's or Mao's. It's narratives, ultimately, that bind people, that motivate people, in some ways that control people. But narratives are also subject to pushback, to implosion. Narratives have to be believable. They have to be acceptable. They have to be widely resonant. Successful narratives are unusual in a global sense, but more importantly in a domestic sense. Those countries that have successful domestic narratives are the most successful countries, provided that narrative admits of complete and total rejection of the narrative at the same time. That's the power of a liberal order, is that it enables people to be against it and has the power to come through that opposition even stronger. And that's the weakness of authoritarian regimes. They're afraid of their own people. They try to control narratives. They try to suppress other narratives. And the reason is because they're vulnerable. Let me finish on China, superpower, India, balance China, use against China. You know, every time I'm in India, you get a sense of how educated, experienced Indians look at the United States as a benighted country. It's a country of fools in charge. It's a country of idiots. It's a country of Trumps and Blinkens and all sorts of rubbish. And then it's a country of amazing conspiracies that can somehow, behind India's back, support Pakistan. Not because it's an idiot, which it was, and that's why it did that, which was self-defeating, but because it's amazing how they can manipulate other countries against their own interests. And so I'm left with this paradox. Does America do things like support Pakistan because it's all-powerful, omniscient, clever, Machiavellian, can't be trusted? Or does America do things like that because it's run by idiots, and therefore it makes mistakes? And these mistakes are not material going forward, because interests that align are more powerful than some imagined conspiracy that was really stupidity. And so India does not in any way suffer the possibility of becoming America's pawn, America's tool, to be used and then thrown away, to be caught up in America's adventures. That's a false understanding of the challenge. The real challenge is, if you figure out how to use American power, there's nothing more powerful. And you can do that without relinquishing your sovereignty. I got to tell you, America's allies give America a lot of lip in conversations behind closed doors. You know how I know? I read the documents when they're declassified as a historian. They push back. They push their own interests. This is true of small countries in many cases, using America for their own purposes. That's the secret to survival and prosperity in the international order. You can ask the Chinese. They did it until they decided it was a threat rather than an opportunity. And you can ask them why they made that decision, because, again, it's a choice that they didn't have to make. And so India has choices in front of it. And those choices are hedge against American power. Go right ahead. Show me what your options are. Show me what else is out there for you. You can hedge against American power. Go right ahead. You're a sovereign country. Denounce American power. Again, go right ahead. You're a sovereign country. Anti-Americanism is something we know well and is profound, deep, everywhere. As I said, the American embassies have the anti-American demonstrations outside of them, and America behaves hypocritically. Or you can figure out how American power can work for you. Because those countries that have done that, they are the most prosperous and stable countries in the world. And their people live really well. And they have freedom. And they have wealth. And they have, yes, strategic autonomy in many, many questions. And they have technology. And they have medical care. And I could go on and I could go on and I could go on. And they send their students to American universities. And they love the H-1B visas. And they can criticize America while building the biggest businesses in America and enjoying those H-1B visas. And you know what? God bless. Let them do that. Because that's the power of America, that it can absorb those criticisms of people who are beneficiaries of American power and know how to use it. Unless you figure out how to use American power, you're in trouble. Because there aren't a whole lot of other options. And if there were, you would use them. You would go after them. And so, I don't tell you what to do. Again, you're a sovereign country. You're going to do what you're going to do. And you're going to pursue your interests as you perceive them. But you tell me how you're going to manage American power, and if it makes sense to me, and if it's successful, you got a really big, big game ahead of you. And if you don't figure that out, I worry. I worry for you. Because the Chinese, they're not gonna be your friend. No matter how much there's appeasement on the Chinese side on occasion, where they retreat a step, it's gonna be 2 and 3 steps forward as soon as they get the opportunity. You can read this in their documents. They say this openly, both externally and internally. And everything they do is to build up the ability to do that. And they're quite good. The Chinese are unbelievably impressive. I would not underestimate them. And so you tell me what you're going to do about that, and I'd love to hear that. And thank you for all your questions, and I apologize for not rising to the occasion for all the questions.
What is to be done is a good question to end with. Thank you, Stephen, for this absolutely wonderful tour de force. Extraordinary.
Thank you, Professor Kotkin, and thank you, Professor Mehta. This was a delightful conversation, and as Pratap rightly said, that this talk is going to be discussed for a long time, and it certainly gave a lot of food for thought for me. I would like to thank India International Center for, at a very short time, they allowed us to host this talk here. So thank you, Ambassador Shyam Sharan and Tete, who helped us organizing this. CPR Chairperson Meenakshi Gopinath for being here with us, and CPR President Srinivas. And thank you to all young RAs at CPR. They did a lot of hard work in putting this together. And thank you, everyone, for taking out time and staying with us for 2 hours and listening to this lecture. Thank you again, everyone.